I'm Bill Hamlet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the Naval Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Wednesday West Theater panel session, Operationalizing Defense Innovation Unit's 3.0 Role for Indo-PACOM and the U.S. Navy. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the panel this morning, Amelia Emmy Probasco. She's a senior fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she works on military applications of artificial intelligence. Emmy is a Naval Academy graduate, former surface warfare officer, was a speechwriter to the Chief of Naval Operations, and is a Rhodes Scholar. That's probably enough on your background. She's assembled a fantastic panel this morning, so I look forward to the conversation and then to your questions. So without any further delay, Emmy, your panel.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's great to have everybody here. If you can't hear us in the back, just raise your hand and we'll try and raise our voices. I'm excited to introduce all the members of this panel. A interesting conversation that already began about 5 minutes ago. So we will have a conversation. I'll open it up for questions at the end if you have that in mind. But let me start by introducing Captain Alex Campbell. Alex is an explosive ordnance disposal officer and defense acquisition professional. He has a wide range of experience in accelerating defense capabilities and development to the warfighters, managed cutting-edge technology projects at places like JSOC, PEO Unmanned Systems and Small Combatants, and Project Overmatch, and he now serves as the Navy lead at DIU. Chris Murphy, just to his left, is the science advisor to the commander of U.S. PAC Fleet, where he facilitates the push and pull between the technical and the operational communities to address the operational gaps that exist. Previously, he worked at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory on missile defense and Aegis and threat weapon systems. He also was a SWO, with tours afloat, SOCOM deployments, and then served as a warfare tactics instructor. And then just to his left, Justin Norman. Justin's got a long bio because he's got several jobs. He's the acting portfolio director and technical director of artificial intelligence and machine learning at DIU. He's also the DIU embed at Indo-PACOM, where he serves as the chief technology officer and deputy director of Indo-PACOM's Joint Mission Accelerator Directorate. Outside of DIU, he's on the Department of the Navy's S&T board. And prior to joining DIU, he worked at several important technology companies, Yelp, Cloudera, Fitbit, Cisco, to name just a few. And he was also, before he entered the private sector, a Marine. He's still a Marine Reserve officer. And it turns out we're all Naval Academy grads at the same time, so we apologize to all of you. Let me start with what's happening at DIU. If you haven't been tracking, there was Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks. I'm sure you saw Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks replicate our announcement. In that announcement, DIU got the dot. A couple of months later in December, you see SecDef out at DIU announcing AUKUS Pillar 2. Admiral Paparo was there yesterday. Doug Beck's on the Hill tomorrow with Undersecretary of Defense for R&E, Undersecretary of Defense for ANS. So there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot going on at DIU. And I want all three of you to try and address what's happening. What did I miss? Because I know I purposefully did not give you the laundry list of things going on for DIU. Why do you think it's happening? And what do you have in order to achieve it? We'll start with you, Alex.
Yeah, of course. No, thanks a lot, Emmy. So I think to understand DIU 3.0, you've got to sort of understand what 1.0 and 2.0 were and why and how we got to, I think, this part of the story, where DIU has been elevated to work directly for the Secretary of Defense. So in 2015, DIU was stood up, and we could consider that DIU 1.0. And 1.0 was really meant to address, and this was established by Secretary Carter, to address basically this relationship that had completely eroded between the DoD and Silicon Valley and the commercial tech world, right? When you look at the early days of Silicon Valley, why did that exist? Because of DoD investment, right? And over sort of decades of non-investment and transitioning to a world where defense primes were really the center of gravity, that relationship had eroded to almost nothing. So 1.0, DIU 1.0 was stood up just to create a presence in Silicon Valley, right? DIU reports directly to SecDef, but we are headquartered in Mountain View, not in the Pentagon, right? And that's very deliberate, and I think it's pretty important. And so in that 1.0 sort of phase, we were just there to say, hey, we're the Department of Defense. We care about commercial tech. We want a relationship with you. We want a relationship with your founders. We want a relationship with your funders. And we want to understand how we can bring the best of commercial technology, which in some ways is, was very much outpacing what the traditional defense industrial base is able to produce, and bring that in, right? Not as an or proposition, but as an and proposition, right? So that we're addressing the entire opportunity that the American industry has to offer, right? And I think we were relatively successful at that, right? Because DIU 1.0 became 2.0. And 2.0 was really about how do I take these relationships that I've built in 1.0, how do I take this understanding, and how do I translate it into taking commercial tech and adapting it for a DoD use case, running that through a prototype with pretty much one thing in mind, taking those prototypes into production. And we've been pretty successful at that. We used what we call a commercial solutions opening, and you can, Defense Acquisition University, you can look that up. Right? That is our business process, it's our acquisition process to competitively bring in commercial tech and then award other transaction agreement contracts and then run prototypes. And when we run prototypes, we run them with end users, right? With hands-on in the mix so that the product we're building and iterating is something that we know is going to be ready to go and aligned with exactly what that end user needs and exactly what that use case is. And we've run over 80 prototypes, and just over 50 of those have transitioned into some sort of production agreement, and in some cases transitioned into real FAR-based production contracts over $100 million, right? We're not running sort of $3 million SBIRs here. We aim to go to production, and we aim to go to production at scale. And back in May, our director, Doug Beck, was named, came on board, was named by SecDef as our new director. At the same time, DIU was elevated to report directly to SecDef. Previous to that, we had been reporting to the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering. And with that, Doug led us through, I think, the beginning of a transformation into DIU 3.0, which is to take that model that I described in 2.0, running prototypes, running them quickly, right? Our typical solicitation to award is about 90 to 120 days. And to scale that. So the two main components when you think about DIU 3.0 are we want to take that model and we want to scale it, but more importantly, we want to create the connective tissue and the direct alignment with the combatant commands and the components of the combatant commands, and I'm excited for Chris to talk about that in a second. But 3.0 is about scale and is about alignment with our strategic partners and being functionally the disruptor on the team, whether that's in the Pentagon or whether that's at the combatant commands, to create the effects and meet the needs and gaps of the combatant commands. So not in short, but that is effectively what DIU 3.0 is, and a little bit of the history that explains how we got to where we are. And it's really about maturing and moving to a much larger scale what we have been able to do over the last 4, 5, and 6 years.
Justin, do you want to add anything to that before we go to Chris to talk about what it looks like from the PAC fleet side?
Sure, and I think it'll be a good segue into Chris having the experience of what it's actually like. So, Alex did a really good job of laying out the history and sort of mentioning where we're going. But I was one of the first people kind of on site at one of these combatant commands, embedding and starting to add some of this connective tissue in perpetuity. And so specifically, we had done a lot of projects, and I've been at DIU now for about 4 years in various capacities. We'd done a lot of work with Indo-PACOM historically, but there were projects that had a very narrow focus or focused in a specific component, or had a technology area focus that didn't look across the entire mission landscape or mission portfolio that a commander has to think through. And so the idea that Doug had was to actually embed, to be a part of the organization, to spend time not just understanding the problems of today, but also where the organization is trying to go, the investments that they're making, the people that are being empowered at all levels of the decision-making process to implement. And so my role has been to apply what DIU kind of does best from an acceleration perspective, from an identifying commercial capabilities, integration perspective, And then also to understand really to skate where the puck is going, to use an analogy of what Indo-PACOM is trying to do from a mission perspective. And what that's looked like is embedding into the most important programs and projects. So for example, the Joint Mission Accelerator is responsible for Joint Fires Network, responsible for Stormbreaker, responsible for the PIMTech program, as well as the Indo-PACOM Mission Network. So these are things that are critically important to achieving the mission landscape that Indo-PACOM and Admiral Aquilino has been really harping on for the last few years, but also looking to leverage what we know and what we have from a DIU perspective from relationships in the Valley, critical core new emerging technologies, and then also, quite frankly, integrating legacy technologies and programs with our more flexible process of acquisition. So that's what it's kind of looked like at a more operational level. And Chris, I think maybe you could speak to what our partnerships look like.
Yeah, so I think it's first important to provide some context for the Pacific Fleet and our approach to taking what we perceive as an operational gap or capability need and translating that into a deployable capability synonymous with a gray hull deployment, right? And that lives on a spectrum from like making it up to making it real. And we do that through a number of different venues and avenues that starts with our exposure to industry, our naval research enterprise writ large, our warfare centers, our UARCs, our FFRDCs, to understand the types of technology that is available to us and helping to apply that to needs. That doesn't mean that we're the source of all good ideas, but once we think we have a solution, we really go for a proactive series of experimentation. And in those experimentations, the output is often more qualitative than we'd prefer. But what that does do is it gives us familiarity with gross categories of technology that we think works. Oftentimes, we've trailed off there a bit, and we've really struggled to pick that up and generate momentum in Washington, D.C., find a program office that is willing to take on that technology, and for all of the laundry list of reasons that the overused term value death exists, we've tried to figure out how we get past that. And in doing so, DIU has really come through over the last year or so with helping to support projects of consequence. Projects that are focused not on metrics like time to contract, which they do a great job of, but with the metric of how do we transition. And that's really, as you see their role evolving as described, a new set of relationships between what DIU's core competencies are, the combatant commander and the supporting components owning that operational vision, the program offices who are ultimately responsible for transition and all of the care and feeding, man, train, equip, sustain, maintain, .mil PFP, ... And then the fourth component there being some sort of technical direction oversight of what is being done. Because none of those other organizations that I named before this really is set up to do that at scale. And everything there is really meant to push towards fielding at scale because our number one goalpost that doesn't change right now is time, right? We will take on and allow the commander to accept or eat performance risk, right? We will eat, cost risk, right? Most inflexible is schedule risk, right? And so an iterative approach where we start small, learn small, supporting a velocity of learning in order to take what is today really maybe an immature prototype and making it real very quickly. And the only way we do that is through that rapid iteration of learning, both in the digital and real world environments.
So if I was to pull a thread across the three of you, the word that was probably said the most just now was scale, but speed, scale, and impact are the ones that I hear the three of you talk most frequently about. So if we kind of tear that apart a little bit, one of the things I've seen in your documents is that scale requires a clear and consistent demand signal to the private sector. So I want to give you an opportunity to say, what's the demand? What do you need? And what would you want to say to the folks in the audience who are trying to help you help the U.S.?
Sure. I'll start with that demand signal, and that demand signal for impact and for scale. I would argue we're, from a DIU standpoint or lens, we're really at the beginning of communicating that demand signal and really understanding the aperture, the wider aperture of what that means. So I think, and certainly we can dig into Replicator here and DIU's role. But I'm going to talk a little bit about specific projects that are getting us started, right? The first one I'll talk about is large diameter UUV, right? And this is where we put solicitations out for real prototypes that are designed to go to production, and to go to production at scale, right? In the hundreds, in the thousands. And so we recently, partnered with PEO Attack Submarines, awarded 3 prototype OTs for a large diameter UUV that is meant to be lower cost, that is meant to be potentially attritable, and is meant to get after problems that Indo-PACOM has, right? The second one I'll reference is a small uncrewed surface vessel that is functionally meant to be an interceptor. Again, relatively low cost, ideally attritable, getting after Indo-PACOM problem sets. I think that solicitation just closed on Monday. And I want you to, from those 2 examples, take away that I think that's just the beginning of other opportunities that are going to become available, both that are very platform and hardware centric, and I think you're probably going to see here in the very near term projects that are more software and data centric. So that, like I said, this is the beginning of us communicating our demand signal, and we're not going to communicate demand signals through RFI. We're primarily going to communicate demand signals through actual solicitations that have actual money behind them and have actual pathways to production and production at scale. And I think that really matters. Because we don't want to just sort of be in this never-ending discussion about what right looks like, right? We want to go out, we want to prototype, we want to iterate, we want to understand, we want to get our hands dirty. We want to get our hands dirty with end users, with partners like PAC Fleet and Indo-PACOM, and build the best sort of minimum viable product to get to production that we can. And so with that in mind, I think you're gonna see a few more solicitations over the next month or 2 that continue to communicate what that demand signal is. But at the end of the day, the demand signal is 1-for-1 directly tied to what the Indo-PACOM commander needs. And that is really our sort of litmus test for how do we define what impact is.
So I won't reiterate the demand signal from our senior leadership, right? It's fairly well documented. But what I do want to reiterate is what makes it possible for us to actually execute that demand signal, right? And that starts with a 2-way street of a conversation, but it really comes down to there are things that we can do up front that maybe we haven't traditionally done that helps us move quickly and scale to help give the government confidence in what we deliver, because oftentimes a prototype still requires a lot of work to make it real. We have to figure out a way to compress that, and we do that by answering certain questions up front, right? And the easiest questions that are answered in a prototype with experimentation is concepts of employment. How are we going to use this thing? Is it going to do what we want it to do? And that's fairly self-evident, fairly early in that selection process. The questions that typically come later on that we need to begin addressing up front are things like concepts of deployment and sustainment, right? How am I thinking about, taking thousands of these things? Am I going to have them sitting on a waterfront, floating in the water, corroding, or am I going to shrink wrap them? What does maintenance look like, right? Do I treat it like a missile that's shrink wrapped and put in a VLS tube for years on end with a bit check, or like a rib on a destroyer that requires an engineman to go out there every day and run the engine? Those are going to drive design decisions that we don't have time to go back and re-engineer later on. And so once we get that through that first gating function of does it do what we think we want it to do, we trip up on the, okay, but what next? We have this other laundry list of things that we have not yet talked about. So it comes down to doing things in parallel, answering questions that would have come later on from the program office up front. And that will help give both the operational community and the acquisition community, I believe, the confidence to invest more heavily upfront with scale. And that should result in a better demand signal to industry.
Yeah, I would agree with both what Alex and Chris is saying. From a lens of a CTO at Indo-PACOM, one thing that I think is really helpful when we start to think about demand signals, also about interoperability and interfaces. Experimentation, validation, and proof points are well and good, but at the end of the day, all these capabilities, all these technologies, all these solutions have to work together to support a mission outcome. And the commander really doesn't care, which logo is where. What he cares about is that when he goes to execute his concept of operations, to Chris's point, that he has confidence in each component and confidence in the outcome. So for me, there are a number of solutions that I've seen that are really powerful, but can't articulate how they will interface or work well with others. And so as you think about, especially responding to some of these solicitations that may be coming in the next weeks to months, think about how teaming and partnership actually plays into the outcome and success of your overall solution. And when I say that, I mean specifically from a technical perspective, what does the interface look like? Is there an API capability? What does the data rights management look like? How will we think about licensing and structure and coordination in an environment which is austere, or perhaps has communications denied pathways? So these types of questions seem like details when you're doing your pitch, but when it comes down to evaluating what actually is feasible and what we can scale to hundreds, thousands, maybe even more of that of iterations or implementations, those are the sorts of things that Chris and I have to think about when we're selecting. And so the demand signal should include all of the things that the commander talked about, and also we should be thinking about how we do that in mass and how we do that in collaboration and partnership.
So, Justin, I'm not surprised that you talked about interoperability and communications given joint fires. And I wonder if you and Chris could talk a little bit about where are we right now on JFN, and what could we expect to see in the next year? And then you get to talk about Replicator, Alex.
All right. Want me to start? Sure. Okay. So for those that are familiar or maybe have not had a chance to be as far up on the latest on it, so the Joint Fires Network is a specific implementation from Admiral Colino's staff of looking at the targeting to target acquisition, weapon target pairing, and then effects on targets process. With a specific Indo-PACOM lens in that AOR. And so really it's about closing kill chains, but also doing that, compressing the amount of time it takes to do that, utilizing the best in automation and the best technology where it is in fact useful, and then of course leveraging human in the loop where it is legally required and also is a part of the correct ConOps. And so there's a number of tools, capabilities, software that goes into making that powerful. But frankly, it is a multi-year journey that we must be on to integrate all of those together, both from a data perspective. We spoke about interoperability. The data fabric and foundation is the first layer of interoperability that's required, but also from a communications pathways perspective. So there will be many different types of platforms, many different types of effectors involved in communicating and executing these kill chains, and they need to be able to coordinate with each other in real time at a much larger battle space than we're traditionally used to. So where we are today is in the implementation of what's called the 1.0 version. So this is about executing and demonstrating the ability to work through the targeting process seamlessly and to execute that within a single pane of glass in a number of key locations throughout the AOR, and I'll leave it kind of there. Where we're going is bringing in best-of-breed technologies and even new capabilities to expand beyond simply the targeting process, but also going into the planning and coordination process, supply chain management, and really eventually into wargaming and artificial intelligence enabled COA generation. So there's a robust, long roadmap of things that we want to be able to do to achieve and sustain overmatch. But where we are today is really focusing on making sure we get the core components right, and that we are sure that, that not only do they function, but they function at scale.
Justin, I think, said it really well. It's about constant change, right? It's not a static chalk line that we set in 2023 or 2024. It's going to continue to evolve, but it requires a humble approach to the interface and the integration piece. And by that, I mean programs that we have no influence over, insight over into necessarily, made decisions last year, yesterday. We'll make different decisions based on different motivations and influences tomorrow and next year. And we need to make sure that that framework is ultimately supportive, because the services and the components are going to bring capability to the theater. And we need to optimize and maximize our ability to employ those, right? That there can be no orphans on the battlefield, and everybody who shows up, we want to play, right? So that's where finding that right interface, that right framework is critical. The other side to that too is that we focus on technology, right? Those are the tangible things that we can grab, we can hold, we can evaluate, we can put metrics on. We're going to be focusing more and more and more on integrating this into joint and fleet operations, building out the training, the watchstanding pipelines, establishing the authorities, the reporting structures that all turn this from a laboratory into something that gets muddy and dirty in the field that delivers a capability in the end. So next year, it's going to change, and I am not going to predict exactly what it looks like. Where I can say we are going to increase our focus is on expanding what that family looks like, right? We're focused on, bringing in the components that have all made investments that support the mission of JFN. We're expanding that to our allies and partners, coalition forces. The more we can bring that in and facilitate the exchange of operational and tactical data, not just emails and PowerPoint slides, the more we bring them into that time-relevant targeting infrastructure.
It's exciting not to be passing around PowerPoint slides anymore. Captain, you still do, Captain Campbell. Replicator has certainly captured a lot of people's attention. It's a huge project. It's ambitious and bold, and how's it going?
It's going great. So before I dig into Replicator, I think it's important. So Replicator 1 is all about all-domain attritable autonomy, right? With a very deliberate focus on problem sets in Indo-PACOM. And so make no mistake, when you think about the C4I and the C2 capability that Chris and Justin just discussed, do not separate that from all-domain attritable autonomy. Because all-domain attritable autonomy requires resilient networking and requires C2 that includes semi-autonomous capability where human beings are still making lethal decisions, right? So you really can't have a conversation about JFN without some conversation about Replicator and vice versa. I think that's really important, that these things nest together, and the integration here and interoperability is so important, right? It's not just about communicating to destroyers for fires missions, right? It's also about communicating to uncrewed systems, also for fires missions with lethal effects, right? But to Emmy's question, how is Replicator going? So, Replicator was initiated by DepSecDef back in August of 2023. And in the 5 months since then, 6 months since then, we have worked with the services. We have worked with the, frankly, prioritized with the combatant commands to understand what systems that fit into this all-domain attritable autonomy category are production ready and can be accelerated, and what capabilities are in prototype that can be accelerated such that it meets the DepSecDef's timeline of deploying thousands of all-domain attritable systems within 18 to 24 months of her announcement, right? So we've already burned up a quarter of our runway. And the good news is that DepSecDef and the Vice Chairman have selected the first tranche of replicator systems. And there is likely some frustration that that hasn't been publicly announced. But please understand that is very deliberate. There's a very important, frankly critical, conceal and reveal strategy when it comes to replicator, right? We do not want our adversaries understanding the detail of the systems that we intend to deploy thousands of to the Indo-PACOM theater, right? And hopefully I trust that makes sense in this room, right? But we're also very conscious that is frustrating to industry, right? Because the idea of production contracts of thousands of platforms, right, or the software that enables the edge collaborative autonomy or automated target recognition, right? Those are tremendous opportunities for industry and certainly for non-traditional defense industry partners, right? We are conscious of that. We want to hear from you, and we want to talk through what that is. But please understand there is a very deliberate sort of sense of what we're going to conceal and reveal. Those projects are, like I said, either in production or are prototypes that can be rapidly accelerated towards production. And we're not done with Replicator 1, right? We are in the stages of finalizing proposals for what we call Tranche 2 of Replicator, which is another, ideally another batch of platforms that can be accelerated to meet that 18 to 24 month timeline. And I think in Tranche 2, really from, direction from senior leadership is to also focus on the software that enables all those platforms to function and to exist and to work together and to do things that frankly we've never seen on the battlefield before. And by that I mean, multi-platform sorties collaborating to create lethal effects and respond to a very dynamic environment against different threats and different different adversary platforms out there. And so we're really excited to be tackling both the platform side and the software side, and ideally pathfinding the route to production for a lot of that work. There's been a tremendous amount of S&T investment over the last decade and 2 decades in this space, and I think we're at a point where we can capitalize on that and capitalize on the non-traditional defense partners out there to accelerate those things into production, right? Because make no mistake, Replicator is not an S&T project. It is get to production in 18 to 24 months, right? So that is what Replicator looks like. Replicator 1. I say Replicator 1 because Replicator isn't about all-domain attritable autonomy. The first instantiation of it is about all-domain attritable autonomy. Replicator 2 is meant, and Replicator 3 and 4 are meant to be top level. Let's get after the department's hardest problems, and let's do them quickly, and let's do them at scale. So DoD leadership now is in the process of identifying the scope of what Replicator 2 is going to be, right? So it's not going to be a more all-domain attritable autonomy. It is going to be some other hard to solve problem that must be solved and must be solved at speed and at scale, right? So the opportunities for Replicator, I think, are going to continue to grow, well beyond what I've just described. And so, I'd invite you to stay tuned for what those look like, and invite you to for a very open dialogue with DIU to understand how those opportunities can be realized. Thanks.
So if we think about the companies that would be interested in participating in either JFN or Replicator or any of the other initiatives that DIU has going on, what is DIU or DoD doing to make it easier? What do you want to tell the audience that would make them feel better that this is going to get easier to work with the DoD to address the sorts of issues that you're asking for their help on?
Well, I can start maybe just by talking through, I've been at DIU for a while, and I could say that, the elevation of DIU to be a direct report is an endorsement of this process, working and being a focus area going forward. So to be clear, 12 to 18 months was the goal. We often beat it. And so when you're thinking about the time frame from getting from prototype all the way through a production contract, and then also, of course, now these problems being much more focused on scale, that's an extremely attractive position to be in if you're coming from industry, from my perspective. Historically, you didn't know necessarily, if you would get the feedback on your investment in enough time to be able to make the financials and the ROI work. And I think at this point, the feedback loop is coming much more quickly, and the demand signal is clearer. So, from an industry perspective, I think what we're doing, to make it better is to actually elevate this process and expand it even wider across a much more deliberate set of theater level, NDOD level, IC level problems. And so I think you're going to continue to see, to Alex's point, a number of solicitations that look like things that industry has perhaps already matured or solved for, and we're really looking forward to bringing that in, utilizing what we've learned about accelerating the process inside of the department.
So I think to add to that, I talked about Replicator a minute ago, and it sounded like a very sort of discrete thing. And to some degree it is, but Replicator is less about all-domain attributable autonomy in 18 to 24 months, and it's more about a process. It is more about the ability to essentially execute on Replicator 1, but then demonstrate, teach, learn, coach, partner with other parts of the DoD so that they can understand how to do what we're doing with Replicator and apply it to different problem sets in different areas. Frankly, I was in a conversation with a program office in Crystal City the other day. I explained what we're doing for Replicator. I explained how we're doing it, the authorities that we're using, and the principal APM at that program office literally said, how are you allowed to do this, right? There's no magical authority. No one's breaking any laws, right? This is about risk and will, and frankly, partnership, right? DIU is not meant to be on an island doing these things on our own. In fact, absolutely the opposite of that. The partnerships that we have with PEOs, the partnerships that we have across the department that have been growing and maturing and, I think starting to blossom, are really where we get to scale, are really how we start to solve beyond, the relatively speaking, when you look at the entire DoD budget, the relatively narrow problems that DIU is solving, right? Our version of success is that that what we're doing with Replicator today, what we're doing with JMAD and JFN and all these different projects, is that mindset, that methodology, that understanding of risk and understanding the value that the commercial tech sector can bring is that there's probably not a better word, but contagion is what we're aiming for.
It's a lot of work. I imagine you need some more people to get it all done. I know you need some more people to get it all done. But let's talk about policies for a second. What are the policy changes, or what are the policies that perhaps you're working really well within that are helping you achieve your goal? That could be acquisition, it could be, sort of other sorts of policies, but tell us what sorts of policies you need to get your job done.
So the typical answer here would start with something like DoD 3000.09 and all that. I'm going to take the answer in the complete opposite direction there. And it comes back to making something from a prototype to making it real. And that ultimately boils down to making it a capability in an operational unit. And the policies that are going to most hamstring or delay the actual effective employment of new types of systems are going to be the nitty-gritty things that are going to pop up that matter to the unit COs and the sailors, right? Where are we in updating our nav dorm, updating all of our operational policies that say you can or can't do something? There are a million great lessons learned from the operational unmanned surface vehicle deployment that happened last year to the Western Pacific, where we took a number of our medium USVs and deployed them and sent them overseas for the first time. And so in that sense, the learning shifted from these sanitized experiments to what does operations look like? And the lessons there, the policies that we came up against is, who is doing things like spectrum requests? What are the policies of our allies and partners that we want to do port visits to that require us to have people on or operate in a certain way when bringing these new types of systems into their territorial waters or ports and harbors. So the more we can accelerate these systems out of the static test ground into dynamic real-world operations, integrate them with the fleet and being, the more I think we're going to identify the policy changes that, maybe they don't say you can't do that, but someone is not going to allow you to do that until you've had the question, done the risk management, and, done it in the real world.
I think I would draft off of what Chris has just been saying, and specifically go towards the allies and partners lens of this. I think everyone recognizes that the sort of conflict domain that we're in requires a not just a joint fight, but a partners and allies fight. We have to work together. We have to communicate together. We have to move in synchronization, and we also have to exchange information. Now, that all sounds well and good on a bumper sticker, but when it comes down to the implementation, physically these are typically done on different entire networks. They are done with systems that were designed in not parallel, but completely isolated paths, roadmaps. And so the challenge is now not do we want to do this, but practically for the policy that's been designed historically to say you can do it, but you need to go through 30 different steps, to actually enumerate and then get into what those steps need to look like for a process that has a deterministic outcome, a real scaled outcome. And so, when we want to communicate on a specific network with a certain type of data with a specific partner, what exact types of validation exercises do you need to do? And then who has the authority to grant and to accept the risk for making that interface? Right now, I think a lot of people would just say, you can't do it, or you can do it, but I don't know who's responsible for it, but I'm not going to accept that risk. We need to get to a place where these questions have answers. And we're recognizing that where the challenges are in cybersecurity, where the challenges are in OPSEC, are opportunities for technological intervention, where that applies, or for the commander to assess the entire battle space and what he or she is willing to accept in terms of operational outcomes. Make no mistake, this is not a theoretical conversation anymore. And I think from a policy perspective, we need to recognize that and make the updates where appropriate.
I'm going to open it up to questions, but if nobody pops up real quick, I'll ask one last question while you're making your way to the mic that's right in the center. You made the point about this is becoming real, and the policies about authorities and all the way down to who has authority to push what button when. And the question is, do folks have the training they need to understand the capes and limbs of these systems to make those kinds of choices yet? And if not, how are we going to get them trained up?
So the answer is probably not today. But it goes back to the principle of doing things in parallel. And so specifically with uncrewed systems and the adoption into the Navy, what we have identified are our primary operational end users. That may involve standing up new USV squadrons. It may entail close partnership with special warfare, but bringing those in for the earliest tests and validations are going to help us develop en route to whatever that deployability is rather than at the end. And also working on shorter development, training, and deployment timelines will also help us to rapidly iterate forward.
Great, thanks. I'm going to turn it over. Go ahead.
Hi, Sam Legrone from USNA News. How y'all doing today? Where's the money coming from? If I look at a traditional Cat 1 program, there's DoD 5,000, there's the acquisition process, there's Congress. They say yes, they say no. There's some OTAs here, but, on the scale of what y'all are talking to, we're getting 8-9 figures pretty quick. So where's the money coming from?
So I think when you look at what we're trying to do here, I don't know that the traditional business model applies in the way that we're all used to, that we all sort of have muscle memory and bias for. The short answer to your question in the near term is reprogramming. That's where it's coming from, right? The longer term answer is that the discussions we've been having through Replicator within the context of JFN and JMAD with Hill staffers and members about what we're trying to do, what the offsets are, what the opportunity is, have been like overwhelmingly positive. And so the answer, I think, in the mid to long term is the money's going to come from Congress, because that's where it comes from.
Yeah, Dan Imbat from Shield AI. Thank you for the information in the panel today. We have a number of efforts with DIU, and we're kind of a non-traditional venture capital-backed company. I wanted to talk a little bit about the funding thing, because we're doing palm drills now for 26. There is a huge valley of death, and I would tell you in the artificial intelligence space, which we are in, we spend most of our time educating folks, because the 8 shops, whether it's Joint Navy, the requirements are not there, and I don't think the professional force is educated enough to be able to write the right requirements to get us there. At the earliest is 2026. So, and we're all in on AI for maneuver for all kinds of platforms, whether it's UUV, USV, or in the air. Where do we go from here to bridge that gap? And with no identified funding, no requirements anywhere, all we're doing is, we're doing OTAs, we do DARPA challenges, we do all that, but what else can we do?
So first of all, thanks. We've spent quite a bit of time, so I appreciate where the question's coming from. Listen, I've had my time in venture-backed startups before as well. I know I deeply empathize with the running the runway conversation. So, I think what Alex has started with was saying our traditional model is maybe not the way we want to start. Might be the place that I would start to answer this. First of all, the 8 shops have a tremendous responsibility set. It's pretty wide. It's not just about providing C2 for autonomy. It's not just about providing AI capabilities. They have to deal with all the experimentation across a variety of different hardware, platform, and software capabilities. So there's a lot going on there. The other thing I would add to is that there are organizations which have sort of stood up in the last couple of years which have specific focus, for example, CDAO, on looking at what the DoD does from an AI perspective, the DoD does from a data perspective and interface perspective between the two. So when you think about where you might spend your time, the education component is useful, but where you spend your chips, where you actually spend your time and who you're speaking to and who you're empowering, I think is also important. And so if it were me, if I was in that seat, where I might spend some time is thinking about who has the responsibility set but not the use cases, who has the responsibility set but not the deep relationships inside of the program or inside of a component command, and act as a bridging force, right? As you have done these OTs, if you've done these prototypes and have these specific experiences but maybe didn't have the larger budget attached to it. And so, the last piece I'll say of it is, there are some really, I think, quite impressive commanders coming into the roles over the course of the next year or so as we work through the confirmation process. I have personally heard more sophistication about statistics, AI, machine learning, and software-defined insert whatever you want than I've ever heard in my entire career. So this is the time now to be leveraging that energy and leveraging that demand signal and having them be your advocate as well. So I would offer that as maybe a bright side of the coin, as well as acknowledging there are still challenges here and there are things to work through.
So PAC Fleet has no RDT&E dollars, right? So, but people come through and they talk to us all the time about how can we do RDT&E. And it comes down to knowing what people's roles are and how you can leverage that for partnership, right? We partner very closely here with DIU. We partner with OSDR&E. We partner with program offices and resource sponsors in the service as well, right? And what that does is it helps to align that operational to programmatic technical piece. And in the course of doing that, we recognize that not everybody has that same experience, especially when you start to think about, anything software defined, right? Software in general, data. And then you start talking about, well, we want to do this, we want to put a contract out there to make a thing. Somebody probably knows the right way to word the data strategy in there or the data rights pieces of it, but there really is not a homogeneous understanding across a lot of organizations with that experience, especially organizations that have traditionally built hardware. I would love to see guidance or templates out of a CDAO-like organization to provide that can be a guideline for how best to engage with you all, so we're not just making it up based off of last known, best guess guidance.
So we've got just a few minutes left here. What I'd love to do is get rapid fire, the three of you, and then we'll go. So we'll ask the first question. Thanks.
Yeah, real quick, my name is Dan Meiji, and I'm the CEO and founder of Firestorm. We use additive manufacturing and a partner-first approach to decrease the time to make a UAV by 80% and to make it for a third to a quarter cheaper than traditional prime approaches. Two quick questions for you. How are you taking lessons learned for technologies and approaches that are working in Ukraine, right, and applying it to the Pacific? And secondly, how do you guys view or not view distributed manufacturing as important to carry out this fight in clearly a contested logistics environment? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Good morning, Lieutenant Dylan Hemming, Unmanned Surface Vessels Division
Can you
1.
get closer to the mic? Thanks.
Lieutenant Dylan Hemming, Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1. So one of the things coming out of Replicator I think that we could expect is a myriad of multiple USVs with their own proprietary autonomy, GUI interface system and whatnot. Is there any intent to try and get that onto a common control system so that we don't have to go through and try and learn 8 different ways to control these vessels and try and streamline that training to us in a very compressed timeline?
Great question. Thank you. Wait 1 second. Yeah, you're ready to go. Last one.
Thank you. Mark Fideli, Vice President of Sales for Chorus. We're a software company that provides program managers, PEOs, portfolio managers, sort of heads-up displays above their spreadsheets and other tools to kind of to build courses of action. One of the things we do consistently is advise on using OTAs or other capabilities to kind of reprogram within the funding that they have as they're executing their projects. Often we hear this question, is this legal? You brought it up. How would you advise, whether it's NAVWAR, chief engineer, functions, or others, to be that voice of this is working, here's how it happens, so that a lot of this community that's ready to pivot with what's familiar can get behind these initiatives through the programs and the PEOs? Thank you.
Those are big questions. Let's start quickly. Can we give a quick hit on lessons learned from Ukraine?
Yeah, Ukraine, I think I saw videos this morning of another Russian ship getting hit by an unmanned surface vessel. So it's easy to draw, quick connections between what they're learning and what we're doing here. And the answer is more complicated than the time here deserves, but the answer is we're facing a fundamentally different challenge in different geographies. Some of the technologies underpinning the capability solutions may rhyme, may be similar, but we have to engage on a different threat set in a different potential scenario. So it's a yes, but.
I think one of the things that's interesting, if we look at the Ukraine example where you've got a lot of different drones, I'll stick with drones for a second, and it goes to the lieutenant's question about operator interfaces, UI, UX, GUI. Those operators were having to switch. I mean, there's like a whole lab that's going on in Ukraine where they're using a bunch of different drones and operators. Are you going to try and address this issue where you're going to send out all these new platforms and then the operators have to learn or relearn? How could you standardize the operator interfaces? Have you thought about that sort of a thing?
Yeah, we're actively addressing that. That's the pacing challenge ahead of all of these hardware platforms. And the mission statement under this effort is we need to command and control heterogeneous unmanned systems at scale through a common command interface across a resilient, software-defined, transport-agnostic mesh network. We're prototyping that. We are agnostic to autonomy, not that we don't care about autonomy, but I need to be able to account for the various types of autonomy that will be delivered with different types of platforms today and tomorrow.
maybe just a foot stomp that. So that's the problem of today, where we already have a homogeneous scenario that we have to deal, or a heterogeneous scenario we have to deal with. As we look towards the future, and we're thinking about scale, we're thinking about which platforms and which capability sets we're evaluating. We're looking for open, we're looking for modular. Let me just say that out loud so that everyone knows. So from the perspective of what we'd like to see, the capability sets are incredible, and we were really impressed by that. However, we need to make sure that the proprietary mechanism lives where it needs to live from an IP perspective, and that the interfaces and the control planes live where we require them to be from a operational requirements perspective. And so those things can coexist, but so the devil's in the details there, and that is the evaluation that we're going through as we look towards future procurement.
Any comments on distributed manufacturing?
Just a quick comment on distributed manufacturing, and to some degree from a replicator standpoint. I think the question was, are we looking at that? And it's a very hard yes, right? Getting bulk materials forward to an austere environment and pre-positioning them makes a lot of sense versus getting exquisite systems delivered directly to a geographic area that matters, and I will leave it at that.
We're working really closely with specific offices in OSD about, let's call it advanced manufacturing. And it's not only this or only that, it's about finding the right knee in that cost curve for what makes sense. If additive has a 10x cost, that doesn't solve a shipyard problem that's already undercapitalized. But if it does allow us to do something new or create things in new ways, then maybe that's where that comes in. Advanced manufacturing, leveraging certified techniques in new ways is a great way to approach the problem set, because certification, the cost associated with recertification of new processes is what is going to slow down, and that sticker shock is what kills most great initiatives at the door.
All right, last question. Do you want to tackle the question of legal acquisition?
Yeah, no, I've been waiting for that all day. So from a DIU standpoint, we have an active program where we essentially bring in contracting officers from any organization, and they ride shotgun for, I think, about a period of 6 months to learn the ins and outs of the commercial solutions opening process, and also just how OTAs work, what they're intended for, what their limits are, so that they get used appropriately, right? OTAs are not a silver bullet, right? OTAs should not become the only contracting mechanism in the DoD, right? It is a tool that works very well. It pairs very well with the commercial solutions opening, and I think that matters, right? And then the other piece that I would say, just in terms of educating program managers, PAPMs, PMs, support contractors, and tech warrant holders, right? The whole crew. I've spent a lot of time in the defense acquisition world, and I spend a lot of my time, and I'm happy to spend a lot of my time just talking about what we do, how we do it, how it can apply to your problem set. And I will just as readily say, yes, I think you should do a DIU project, as I will say, no, I think you should probably go this path or that path. Because DIU is not the sort of end all be all solution, but it does have tremendous application, especially within the context of bringing in non-traditionals and commercial tech.
Well, great. Thanks everyone for staying for the conversation. Thanks for the great questions, and I hope you can join me in giving our panel a round of applause. Thank you.
On behalf of the U.S. Naval Institute and AFCEA International, we thank our speakers on the panel for taking the time to join us today, for your insights and thoughts. We'd like to present you with a token of our appreciation, a Naval Institute book, U.S. Naval Power in the 21st Century by Brent Settler. And before you guys head out to lunch or your next panel, please take a moment to complete the session survey in the West app. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.